Before sunrise touched the Blue Ridge pickup trucks were already lined along Route 58, their drivers staring through a fence at 40 acres everyone had once called worthless. A soil specialist had driven 2 hours. A specialty buyer from Charlotte had returned for the third time after being refused twice. Farmers who had laughed at the property now stood silently beside their vehicles trying to understand why the rocky northern slope had changed overnight. At the center of it all, Zebediah Calloway moved alone between rows of purple flowers, his red and navy plaid shirt bright against the dark soil tan gloves cupping each bloom with the care of a man handling something years in the making. Across Meadow Creek, Jarvis Ferris watched from his own fence, his posture rigid and his confidence beginning to crack. Nobody outside the gate knew what Zebediah had planted, what it was worth, or why he had kept silent for 2 years. They only knew that the man they had dismissed had seen something in that broken ground that none of them had been patient enough to notice.
By the third week of October, pickup trucks were lining Route 58 before the sun touched the ridgeline. Nobody had been invited. Nobody had been told a single thing. But word had escaped the way it always does in a small Virginia county where everybody knows everything about everybody, except this time nobody knew the one detail they all desperately wanted. A soil consultant from Blacksburg had driven 2 hours just to stand outside a fence line and stare. A buyer from a Charlotte specialty food company had shown up at the gate, twice been refused twice, and was now sitting in his rental car on the gravel shoulder for the third time in 2 weeks, watching and waiting with the particular patience of a man who had decided that whatever was growing on those 40 acres was worth the inconvenience. Jarvis Ferris, who owned 400 acres across Meadow Creek and had not spoken a civil word to Zebediah Calloway in several years, was leaning on a fence post at the eastern edge of his property, squinting across the water with an expression his wife Beatrix recognized immediately. It was the expression of a man who had begun to understand that he had missed something important, and the understanding was arriving too late to do anything useful about it. Farmers from across Grayson County were leaving notes in Zebediah's mailbox. People with no connection to farming at all were asking questions at the hardware store in Independence. 3 mysteries hung over those 40 acres like morning fog over the Blue Ridge. What was growing on that hillside? What had Zebediah Calloway planted on land that most people said could not grow anything worth harvesting? And why, through all of it, had he refused to say a single word to anyone? Before we go any further, if this kind of story speaks to you, if you believe that patience and knowledge can turn dismissed land into something extraordinary, subscribe and join this community. Drop your state in the comments below. We love knowing where our viewers are watching from, and your region might find its way into a future story. Zebediah Calloway was 59 years old and had spent most of those years making careful, quiet decisions that the people around him rarely understood until it was too late to copy him. He grew up in Floyd County, Virginia, the youngest child of a tobacco farmer named Orville, who died owing more to the bank than his land was worth. Zebediah was 19 years old the morning of that funeral. The rain came in slow and sideways off the mountain, and he stood at the graveside without an umbrella letting it come. He was not crying, he was counting. He counted the neighbors, the church members, the men from the co-op who had driven out to pay their respects. 31 people stood in that rain, and somewhere in the back of his mind, even at 19, Zebediah understood something about those 31 people that he could not yet put into words. Every single one of them had known his father was going to fail. They had known it for years, maybe decades. They had watched the soil deplete and the debt accumulate, and the margins shrink, and not one of them had said a useful word about it. He filed that understanding away and carried it with him for 40 years. There is a particular kind of education that cannot be bought in a classroom and cannot be compressed into a shorter timeline. And Zebediah Calloway received his over the course of 2 decades driving the back roads of southwestern Virginia with a truck full of equipment and a notebook that he replaced every 18 months when it filled up. He saw farms that had been in the same family for 4 generations, slowly losing the thing that made them worth keeping. He saw good men make the same mistakes their fathers had made because nobody had ever sat down with them and explained what was actually happening in the soil beneath their feet. He wrote it all down. Every soil type, every drainage pattern, every mineral deficiency, and its visible effects on yield and plant health. He filed reports that were read and sometimes acted on and sometimes filed away in county offices, where they gathered dust alongside reports from the decade before. He was patient about this. He understood that knowledge moves slowly through institutions and that the most useful thing he could do was accumulate the understanding himself and wait for the right ground to apply it to. He spent 20 years as a soil technician for the Virginia Cooperative Extension driving county roads and reading other people's land pulling cores and measuring pH and writing reports that told farmers what they already half knew but did not want to hear. It was good work, honest work, but it was never his work. Every soil profile he cut, every drainage problem he mapped, every depleted field he walked and documented, he was doing it with one part of his mind somewhere else entirely, somewhere in the future, on a piece of ground he had not yet found. 20 years is a long apprenticeship, but Zebediah was never in a hurry to begin something before the conditions were right. Then his knee gave out. He had the surgery in the spring, and during the recovery, he sat in a chair by the window of his house in Floyd County for 11 weeks with a legal pad on his lap and a mechanical pencil in his hand. His wife, Margaret, brought him coffee in the mornings and did not ask too many questions. She had been married to him long enough to recognize the look on his face. It was the look he got when he was building something in his head that he was not yet ready to name out loud. What he was building had been under construction for a very long time. He had started keeping notes on saffron in 2014, 3 years before Margaret's diagnosis, and 4 years before he would sign a single deed. The notes were not casual. They were the kind of notes a man keeps when he already knows what he is going to do and is simply waiting for the world to catch up. Market prices by year going back to 2008. A list of fine dining restaurants in Asheville and Charlotte that source specialty ingredients locally. Names of spice importers in New York and Philadelphia. A hand-drawn map of Virginia microclimates with certain elevation bands circled in red pen regions, where the combination of cool nights, well-draining slopes, and moderate humidity created the exact conditions that saffron crocus sativus, the most expensive spice in the world, by weight required to produce threads worth harvesting. Rocky, elevated, well-draining slopes, the kind most people looked at and walked away from. Margaret had been the one to name it. Not the crop, but the decision. She was in the hospital the third time when she said it, lying in a bed with tubes in her arm, and the particular kind of calm that comes to people who have stopped pretending. She said, "Zebediah, I do not want you to wait anymore. You have known what you wanted to do since you were 30 years old." He had not answered right away. He sat in the chair beside her bed and looked at his hands for a long time. She said, "Land does not lie. You always told me that. Go find out if you were right." She died 4 months later. He bought the 40 acres in Grayson County 2 months after that. The property sat at the end of a gravel lane off Route 58, 40 acres of what the previous owner had farmed hard and abandoned harder. 30 years of cattle without rotation, without cover crops, without a single soil test. The lower sections were compacted clay that shed water instead of holding it. The upper slopes were rocky and shallow soil, the kind of ground that made extension agents wince when they walked it. Jarvis Ferris had looked at the same property 2 years before Zebediah. He walked it once, spent maybe 40 minutes on it, shook his head and left. He told anyone who asked, nothing profitable grows in ground like that. Zebediah paid $180,000 for it. The man at the real estate office looked at him the way people look at someone who has just made a very public mistake and offered a small, sympathetic smile that Zebediah did not require. He moved in on a Tuesday in late September, 2 years before those trucks would line up on Route 58. He had 1 truck, 2 boxes of kitchen items, a cot for the first few weeks, and a soil probe that he had owned for 19 years and sharpened himself twice a year, whether it needed it or not. That first morning, before he even unpacked the kitchen boxes, he walked every inch of those 40 acres with the probe in one hand and a legal pad in the other. He was not looking at what the land was. He was looking at what it could become, which is a different kind of looking entirely, and it requires a different kind of patience than most people are willing to practice. He met Jarvis Ferris on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks after moving in. The diner in Independence was called Ridgeline, and it had been the unofficial gathering point for Grayson County farmers since before Zebediah was born. He went in for coffee and eggs, took a seat at the counter, and had gotten no further than his first cup when Jarvis Ferris came through the door with Landon, who ran the farm supply store on the edge of town, and two other men Zebediah recognized from the feed co-op. Jarvis was 64 years old and built like a man who had been doing physical work his entire life and was proud of it. He had 400 acres in corn and hay across Meadow Creek, a newer tractor than he needed, and opinions about every farm in the county that he shared freely and without invitation. He sat down 2 stools from Zebediah, ordered coffee, and said without looking directly at him loud enough for the whole counter to hear that he had walked that property on Route 58 2 years back. Said the topsoil on the upper slopes was thinner than his palm. Said whoever paid full price for that ground had either made a serious miscalculation or had money they were not particularly attached to. The diner went quiet in the particular way it goes quiet when people are listening hard while pretending not to. Zebediah looked up from his coffee. He looked at Jarvis Ferris for a moment with an expression that was not hostile and was not particularly warm either. Then he said, "Thank you for that, Jarvis," and went back to his eggs. 5 words. No argument, no defense, no explanation. The silence that followed those 5 words was more uncomfortable than any argument would have been. Jarvis Ferris was not accustomed to men who did not feel compelled to defend their decisions. He finished his coffee faster than usual and left without saying much more. On the drive home, he told Beatrix that Zebediah Calloway was not normal. Beatrix had known Zebediah since high school, had watched him work with a precision and patience that most men in the county lacked entirely. She looked at her husband and said that Zebediah had never been normal, according to the way Jarvis used that word, and that was probably not a bad thing. Jarvis did not respond to that, which was itself a kind of answer. Zebediah did not plant a single seed that first year, not one. What he did instead made no sense to anyone watching, and people were watching more than he realized. He ran a subsoiler 18 inches deep through the compacted lower fields to shatter the hard pan that had formed beneath 30 years of overgrazing. He hauled wood chip mulch by the truckload and spread it thick across the rocky upper slopes, not to make them look cared for, but because wood chips, as they decompose, feed the biology that depleted soil desperately needs restored. He drilled cover crops into every open acre before the first frost: crimson clover and tillage radish and winter rye, not because they would produce anything marketable, but because they would feed the soil through the cold months instead of leaving it bare and leaching. In spring, he applied finished compost from a windrow operation he sourced 2 counties over, the dark, heavy kind that smells like a forest floor. The morning after hard rain, rich with bacterial activity that broke down organic matter into minerals plants could actually use. He had the soil tested 4 times, each sample sent to a different laboratory to cross-reference the results and eliminate any single lab's margin of error. Then he began balancing minerals with the kind of precision most farmers in Grayson County had never bothered with. Calcium to loosen compacted structure and open the soil to air and water movement. Sulfur to activate certain biological processes that regulate nutrient availability. Boron in small measured amounts, because boron deficiency quietly limits the reproductive yield of crops that most growers never think to check for. At the co-op one afternoon, Landon said to nobody in particular that Zebediah Calloway was spending money on dirt, and the men standing around the seed display laughed in the easy way people laugh when someone else is making what they all agree is a mistake. Zebediah was 2 aisles over. He heard every word. He paid for his supplies and drove home and did not mention it to anyone. He was usually the first person awake on that road. Before the nearest neighbor's porch light came on, he was already out there. Coffee thermos in one hand, soil probe in the other. Watching something the rest of them could not see yet. Something that was not visible to the eye, but that he could read in the way the soil compacted under his boot, and the way water moved across the surface after rain, and the way the cover crop roots behaved when he pulled a test plant and examined what the underground was doing. What he was watching for was a change in the soil's behavior that most people would not think to look for, because most people did not know it was possible in this short a time frame. Depleted soil that has been overworked and stripped of its biology through decades of heavy grazing without recovery time does not simply rest when the pressure is removed. It remains depleted unless something actively feeds it back to life. What Zebediah was doing with the cover crops and the compost and the mineral balancing was not resting the land. He was feeding a biological system that had been starved and asking it to rebuild itself. And biological systems, when they are given what they need after a long deprivation, respond with a speed and completeness that can surprise even people who understand the science of it. By the middle of that first summer, the earthworm population in the lower field had increased to a level he had not expected to see until the end of year 2. He counted cores. He took photographs. He sent samples to the lab, and the results came back better than his most optimistic projection. Something was happening in that soil that the men at the co-op, with their easy laughter about money spent on dirt, did not have the vocabulary to see. The questions started piling up by the second summer. Gwendolyn Whitmore, a soil specialist with the Virginia Cooperative Extension, and a woman Zebediah had worked alongside for 11 years before his knee forced him out, drove down one afternoon with her equipment case and her clipboard. She walked the fields for 2 hours, cutting profiles and photographing root structure in the methodical way of someone who has done this work long enough that efficiency and care have become the same motion. She did not say much until she was loading her equipment back into her truck, at which point she stopped and looked at Zebediah across the hood. She said, "Are you doing this for something specific or just restoring in general?" Zebediah said specific. Gwendolyn studied him for a moment. She knew him well enough to know that asking a follow-up question would get her nothing she wanted. She said all right and got in her truck and drove the 45 minutes back to Galax. But on the way, she made a phone call to a colleague at Virginia Tech and asked about growing conditions for high-value specialty crops in the elevated sections of Grayson County. Her colleague asked what she had in mind specifically. She said she was not entirely sure yet. That was not quite true, but it was what she was willing to say at that moment. Zebediah had one neighbor who never laughed at him. Imogene Kinsley was 71 years old and owned 15 acres on the western edge of his property that she no longer farmed actively. Her husband Calhoun had planted apple trees on ground that everyone in the county said was too cold and too rocky for orchards. He had done it methodically, choosing varieties suited to the elevation, amending the soil carefully over several seasons, staking young trees against the wind with the patient thoroughness of a man who fully expected to still be doing this 20 years from now. He died of a heart attack in his second season before a single tree had produced fruit. Imogene had harvested those apples alone for 3 years afterward and sold them to a cider operation in Galax. She had done it quietly, without complaint, without asking anyone for help. She was not offered because the work needed to be done, and she was the one who was there. The first autumn after Calhoun died, she had gone out to the orchard in late September and stood among the trees that were just beginning to produce their first real fruit trees that her husband had planted and staked and pruned and watered and talked to on early mornings when he thought nobody was watching. She had stood there for a long time before she understood what she was feeling, which was not only grief, but also something she eventually recognized as obligation. Not obligation in the heavy sense of a burden she had not chosen. Obligation in the sense of a promise that deserved to be kept. Calhoun had been right about that ground. He had known something that the people around him had refused to understand, and the only way to prove it was to finish what he had started. So she had learned to harvest, learned the equipment, learned the relationship with the buyer in Galax. And she had kept going for 3 years, and then a fourth, and then a fifth, until the orchard was established and productive, and the proof was in the fruit itself. She knew what it looked like when a person worked towards something the rest of the world had not caught up to yet, because she had watched Calhoun do it until the day he could not, and then she had done it herself. One morning in November, she walked a covered dish of cornbread down to Zebediah's fence line, set it on the post, and walked back to her house without knocking or waiting. Zebediah saw her from the upper slope, set down his tools, and walked down to the fence. He stood there for a moment, looking at the covered dish, and then back at the road Imogene had already disappeared from. He picked it up and carried it inside. He did not understand yet why she had done it. He would eventually. His daughter Cordelia came up from Roanoke that first April and stood in the middle of what looked to her like an enormous amount of money spread across the ground with nothing to show for it. She was 31 years old and managed construction projects for a firm in the city, and she applied that same logical framework to everything, which was one of the qualities Zebediah admired most about her, and which was currently creating a tension between them that neither acknowledged directly. She asked him how much he had spent. He did not avoid the question. She asked how long the money would last if nothing came of this. He did not answer that one directly. Instead, he walked her to the slope at the north end of the property and crouched down and pushed his finger into the earth and told her to look at the roots of the cover crop coming through. She crouched beside him. The roots were white and fine, and they had driven deep into the soil in the particular way that only happens when the soil structure is beginning to open up, when the biology is beginning to work, the way biology is supposed to work when it has been given what it needs. He said that soil could not do this 2 months ago. She looked at the roots and then at her father's face and then back at the roots. She did not ask more questions that afternoon. But later that night, while Zebediah was outside doing a last check on the cover crop, she found a notebook on the kitchen shelf. It was not the soil testing notebook she had seen before. This one was different. She opened it to the first page. There was a date at the top, March 2014. Below it were columns of market data saffron prices by year across a full decade, restaurant contacts in Asheville and Charlotte, importer names in New York, a hand-drawn map of Virginia with elevation zones marked in red pen. She stood in the kitchen and read through several pages in the quiet way you read something when you are trying to understand how long a thing has been in motion. The data was not rough or exploratory. It was the finished work of someone who had already made a decision and was building the documentation around it. She closed the notebook, put it back exactly where she had found it, and stood at the window looking out at the dark slope where her father was walking with his flashlight. She drove back to Roanoke the next morning without asking about it, but she took something with her that she had not brought when she came. She was not sure yet what to call it, only that it had changed the shape of her worry from shapeless anxiety into something with edges she could think about more precisely. Then came the February night that Zebediah would not tell anyone about for a long time. The temperature dropped to 14 degrees Fahrenheit, colder than that ridge had seen in several years. He woke up at 2 in the morning with the certainty that something was wrong. He pulled on his coat and his boots and went out with a flashlight and walked the lower section of the north slope, where a portion of the crimson clover had been thinning for the past 2 weeks in a way that suggested cold stress. He crouched down and played the light across the ground and saw what he had half feared. The top growth was dead, not all of it, but a section across the lower edge of the zone, maybe a quarter of what he had planted there, had been killed by the freeze. He knelt in the frozen dark for a long time. It was not the loss itself that moved through him. Any farmer knows that losses come, and any farmer who has studied soil understands that a surface setback is not necessarily a root setback. It was something underneath the loss, something colder and quieter. He was 58 years old, kneeling on frozen ground in the dark in Grayson County, Virginia, and Margaret was gone, and nobody alive knew what he was trying to do here. And for the first time since he had bought this land, he felt the specific weight of what it meant to be doing the right thing at possibly the wrong time. The doubt was not about the plan. It was about the years, whether he had waited too long, whether the right time had passed while he was still preparing for it. He stayed there until the thought ran its course. Then he pushed his hands into the frozen soil beside one of the damaged plants and dug down with his fingers until he found the root mass below the frost line. It was intact. The mulch layer he had spread in October had protected the root zone even while the surface froze. The biology below was alive. The loss was real, but it was surface loss only. The foundation had held. He went inside and made coffee and opened his notebook and wrote one line: Zone 1 partial loss. Zones 2 and 3 intact. Adjust mulch depth in spring. Then he closed the notebook and sat at the table until first light came through the window. He thought about his father. He thought about the particular way Orville Calloway had never talked about what was happening to his land, had watched the yields drop every year for the last 15 years of his life, and had treated it as weather as fate, as the kind of thing that happened to a man when his luck ran bad, rather than as a problem with a solution that he simply did not know how to find. Zebediah had loved his father, and he had watched his father fail, and he had understood from an early age that love and clarity were not the same thing, and that the most respectful thing he could do with what that failure had cost his family was to learn from it completely rather than repeat it out of loyalty to familiar patterns. He thought about 31 people in the rain. He thought about the particular courage it takes to continue working towards something when the only person who knew what you were building was no longer alive to see whether you finished it. He thought about Margaret's voice in the hospital room, steady and certain, in a way that the body it came from no longer was. And he thought about the specific quality of being known by another person so completely that they can give you instructions from a hospital bed that hold their validity years after they are gone. He sat there until the sky outside the kitchen window began to lighten from black to gray to the pale gold that precedes sunrise on a clear February morning. Then he went back outside and got to work. The specialty corms arrived at the end of August in the second year. Temperature-controlled shipping, small cardboard cartons packed in breathable material, a return address from a specialty grower in Pennsylvania. Zebediah signed for them alone at the gate. He loaded them onto his truck and drove up the north slope and spent the rest of the day planting by hand across the rocky upper ground that Jarvis Ferris had dismissed without a second glance. The work was slow and specific. Each corm had to be placed at the right depth and spacing oriented correctly in soil that had been prepared with 2 years of deliberate care to receive exactly this. The rocky drainage that everyone had read as a flaw was precisely the characteristic that made this ground valuable for this particular crop. He worked alone. He refused help when it was offered. When a neighbor from down the road walked up the lane and asked what was in the boxes, Zebediah told him to have a good evening. When Landon asked at the feed store the next morning what had come in that temperature-controlled truck, Zebediah bought what he came for and drove home without answering. Cordelia called that evening. She had heard about the delivery from someone who had heard from someone else, which was how information moved in Grayson County, regardless of whether the people involved wanted it to move. She asked what was in the boxes. Zebediah told her it was planting stock. She asked what kind. He said she would see next fall. She waited a moment on the line, and then she said the name she had called him since she was small and stopped. And he could hear her trying to decide how to ask the question that was actually underneath the question. He waited her out. She said, "Are you all right?" He said he was. She said, "Okay." And they talked for a few more minutes about ordinary things, and when she hung up, she sat in her apartment in Roanoke and looked at the phone for a while. That night, Zebediah finished planting the last row after dark, working by flashlight on the upper slope. When the final corm was in the ground and the soil was leveled and the work was done, he turned off the light. He stood in the full dark for a moment, and then he sat down on the rocky slope right there on the ground and put both hands flat against the earth. The sky above Grayson County was clear and deep in the way it gets at elevation in late August. More stars than most people in cities ever see in their lives. He thought about his father buried in Floyd County with more debt than land. He thought about Margaret. He thought about a row of old bricks he had uncovered in the lower field 3 weeks after buying this place. Bricks laid deliberately along a drainage line by someone who had stood on this same ground before him, who had seen the same potential and begun the same slow work, and who had never finished it, or had not lived long enough to finish it, or had been stopped by something Zebediah would never know. Someone had been here first, had seen what he was seeing, and had not given up from lack of vision, but from lack of time. He understood that feeling now in a way he had not before Margaret died. He sat there until the dew came down and the air smelled like late summer soil cooling at the end of a long day. Then he stood up and tucked the flashlight under his arm and walked down the slope to his truck. There was a note folded under the windshield wiper. He unfolded it under the dome light. Landon's handwriting careful and a little apologetic around the edges. It said that Jarvis Ferris had been asking around about the commercial cultivation permit that Zebediah held on that property. Landon said he had not told Jarvis anything, but he thought Zebediah ought to know. Zebediah read the note twice. He folded it and put it in his shirt pocket. He sat for a moment in the dark truck, looking out at the field he had just planted. Jarvis was not simply curious. Jarvis was looking for a lever, something that would let him intervene in a situation he could not yet name, but already understood he had underestimated. Zebediah started the truck and drove down the lane toward the lights of his house. He was not angry. He was something closer to settled. Every piece of paper on that property was exactly what it needed to be because he had made sure of that before he planted the first cover crop 2 years ago. There was nothing to find. The note from Landon stayed in Zebediah's shirt pocket for 3 days before he threw it away. Not because he forgot about it, because he needed to think about what it meant without acting on that thinking while it was still forming. Jarvis Ferris had not confronted him directly. That was the part worth paying attention to. A man who believed he was simply in the right went to the other man's face. A man who was not sure of his footing went around. That distinction told Zebediah something useful about where Jarvis actually stood, which was not in the position of strength that 400 acres and 30 years of farming the same way might suggest. He put the note in the trash on a Thursday morning and went back to work. September arrived the way September does in Grayson County. Cool mornings that still carried the heat of summer in the middle of the day, the light going golden earlier than you expected. Meadow Creek running lower and clearer than any other month of the year. On the upper slope, Zebediah watched the ground every morning. He was watching for the first sign of emergence, the first thin thread of green pushing up through the soil. The corms needed time. He knew that. But knowing a thing and living through the waiting are separate experiences. By the second week of September, people he had never spoken to were leaving notes in his mailbox. A farmer from the far end of the county wrote, asking if he was running an experimental program through the extension and whether outside growers could participate. A woman from Independence whose husband had lost most of their acreage in a bankruptcy wrote, asking if Zebediah was hiring for any seasonal work. A soil consultant from Blacksburg, a man Zebediah vaguely recognized from a conference years earlier, showed up at the gate one afternoon with his card and a request to walk the fields. Zebediah thanked him and watched him drive away. The hardware store in Independence had apparently become the informal clearinghouse for speculation. Zebediah heard this from Imogene Kinsley, who had been to town for feed and come back with the information delivered in her particular dry way, which was to state a fact and then look at you steadily until you responded. He said, "What are they saying?" She said everything except the right thing. He nodded. She went back across the fence to her own property, and he went back to his work. Norval Burwell arrived the second time on a Wednesday afternoon in the third week of September. He had driven from Charlotte again, a 4-hour round trip, and he did not look like a man who made 4-hour round trips for things he was not serious about. He was younger than Zebediah by about 15 years, well-dressed, in the careful way that people from food industry money dress when they are trying to seem approachable in a rural setting. He had a checkbook in his jacket pocket and a number in his head that he believed was generous. He got as far as the gate. Zebediah came down from the slope when he saw the car. He listened to Norval's offer without interrupting. It was by any reasonable measure a serious number. He listened to all of it, and then he said, "There is nothing to sell yet. Come back after harvest." Norval said he needed to lock in a price before the market knew what Zebediah had. He said that was actually better for Zebediah, that it protected him from volatility. Zebediah said, "That is exactly why I am not signing anything right now." Norval drove away. En Route 58, heading back toward the interstate, he made 3 phone calls. One to a restaurant group in Asheville, one to a spice broker in New York, one to a food writer in Raleigh who had been asking for months about domestic saffron sources. He did not give any of them a name or a location, but he told them to be patient for a few more weeks. What happened next is the part Zebediah did not find out about until Gwendolyn Whitmore told him. And Gwendolyn told him only because she felt she owed him the information before he heard it from someone else. Norval Burwell had driven out to Imogene Kinsley's property the following morning. He had done his research well enough to know that Imogene owned the land adjacent to the west, and he had driven up her lane with a version of the same pitch he had delivered to Zebediah, adjusted for the fact that Imogene was not the grower, but might be willing to act as an intermediary for a reasonable consideration. Imogene let him finish his entire presentation. She was sitting on her porch steps and she did not invite him to sit, and she did not offer him anything, which in Grayson County is a social signal clear enough that a person from Charlotte ought to have been able to read without difficulty. When he was done, she said, "You drove up here to ask me to help you buy something from my neighbor at a lower price than you know it is worth." He started to explain that was not quite how he would characterize it. She said, "I think you should go back to your car now." And he went. She told Gwendolyn about it 2 days later when Gwendolyn stopped by on an unrelated matter. Gwendolyn told Zebediah on the phone that evening. Zebediah listened without saying anything for a moment. Then he said, "Gwendolyn, whatever Norval Burwell does or does not do is not my concern. My concern is the ground on that slope and what is coming up through it." Gwendolyn said she understood that. Then she said, "Zebediah, he also came to see me." The phone was quiet for a moment. She explained that Norval had come to the extension office in Galax, not to the main desk, but to her directly, having gotten her name from someone who knew she had been on the property. He had asked general questions about soil remediation projects, about specialty crop trials, about whether the extension was partnering with any private growers on high-value horticultural experiments. He had been professional and indirect, and she had given him nothing. But the fact that he knew to come to her meant that someone along the chain had talked more than they should have. Zebediah said, "Who do you think it was?" Gwendolyn said she did not know for certain, but the soil consultant from Blacksburg had mentioned to at least 2 people that he had tried to visit the property and been turned away, and in the ecosystem of agricultural gossip, that kind of detail accumulated, meaning faster than the facts could catch up with it. Zebediah thanked her and hung up and went back outside. There were still 2 hours of light left, and he was not going to spend them in a chair thinking about Norval Burwell. Gwendolyn came back out to the property the following week. It was her second visit in less than a month. She brought more equipment than the first time and cut soil profiles in 4 different locations on the upper slope, working methodically, photographing root structures, occasionally stopping to look at something with the particular stillness of a scientist encountering a result she had expected but not quite believed she would find in the timeline she was looking at. After 2 hours, she packed her equipment and walked over to where Zebediah was working near the eastern edge. She asked him about the calcium to magnesium ratio in the upper horizon. He gave her the numbers from the spring test. She wrote them in her notebook without responding for a moment. Then she said, "You have been building this for 2 full years." She was not asking. He said yes. She said the root density in the northern zone was something she genuinely did not expect to see on the soil type after this short a timeline. Whatever he had done with the cover crop sequencing had worked at a level she would not have predicted on paper. He said he appreciated that. She looked at him steadily. She said, "Zebediah, if you are growing what I think you are growing, you know the harvest window is 10 days at the outside." He said he knew. She said, "You will need people." He said he was working on it. She closed her notebook. Before she got in her truck, she turned back and said, "When this is done, I want to write about it. Not a report, a story, something that other growers can actually read and learn from." He said after harvest. She drove away, and on the road back to Galax, she was already organizing what she knew into the structure of something worth telling. The permit call came on a Friday. Xander Hargrove, the county commissioner, had been a fixture of local government for long enough that his calls were usually about predictable things. When Zebediah picked up, Xander was apologetic in the careful way of a man caught between an obligation to a longtime friend and an awareness that the friend had put him in an uncomfortable position. He said that a question had come in about the commercial cultivation permit on Zebediah's property. He said everything appeared to be in order from the county's perspective. He was just letting Zebediah know as a courtesy. Zebediah asked who had raised the question. Xander paused. Then he said Jarvis Ferris had called him earlier that week. Zebediah thanked him, confirmed everything was documented and in order, and told Xander he could let the inquiry rest. He hung up and sat with that information for a moment. Not with anger, with clarity. Jarvis had tried through Landon. When that produced no visible response, he had moved to a more formal channel. He was methodically looking for a lever that did not exist. Every piece of paper on that property was exactly what it needed to be. But the permit call had done something Jarvis probably had not intended. It had traveled. Xander Hargrove was not a gossip in the direct sense, but information moves in small counties through the ordinary channels of people who talk to people who talk to people. And by the following Tuesday morning at Ridgeline, several farmers at the counter knew that someone had called the county about Zebediah Calloway's operation, and most of them had concluded correctly about who had made the call. Beatrix heard it from a friend on Wednesday. She came home and found Jarvis in the garage and asked him directly. He said he had just been asking a question. She said, "Jarvis, you called the county commissioner and asked him to look into Zebediah's paperwork. That is not asking a question. That is something else." He said he was just making sure everything was above board. She said Zebediah Calloway has been above board in everything he has ever done since the day I have known him. And you know that, and if you are doing this because you are worried about what he has figured out that you have not, that is a conversation we should have directly and honestly, instead of one that routes through the county commissioner's office. Jarvis did not answer. He picked up a wrench and turned back to what he had been doing. Beatrix stood in the garage doorway for a moment and then walked back into the house. That night, Jarvis sat at the kitchen table after dinner and did not watch television the way he usually did. He had 400 acres in corn and hay. He had operated the same rotation for going on 25 years. He bought bigger equipment on a regular cycle because bigger equipment meant efficiency, and efficiency meant you could manage more acres with less labor. And managing more acres was how a man in commodity farming stayed ahead of margins that had been getting thinner every decade since he started. He had done everything the way his father had done it, only faster and with better tools. What the tractor note and the operating loan and the input costs added up to at the end of a good year was a margin that had been, if he was honest with himself, shrinking for the past 7 years, despite the fact that he was doing everything right. The right things in a framework that was quietly becoming the wrong framework, and nobody around him had said so, maybe because they were all inside the same framework and none of them wanted to name it. He had walked Zebediah's 40 acres 2 years ago and calculated failure in 40 minutes and moved on. He had done what efficient men do, which is to make fast decisions based on known patterns. The possibility that the pattern itself was the problem had not occurred to him. It was occurring to him now, sitting at his kitchen table in the November dark, and the arriving of it was not comfortable. He had 400 acres. That was the fact he had built his identity around for most of his adult life. 400 acres was something. 400 acres meant you were a serious farmer, not a hobby operation, not a man playing at something he half understood. He had expanded carefully over 20 years, buying adjacent parcels, when they came available, consolidating his operation into something that ran with the efficiency a business of that scale required. He had equipment that was worth more than some people's houses. He had a credit line at the county bank that the loan officer treated with respect. He was by any external measure a successful man. What he was sitting with now in the quiet of his own kitchen in the middle of the night was the possibility that all of that success had been built inside a box he had never once examined from the outside. He had been playing the game he knew, playing it well, and the game itself had been slowly changing around him in ways he had not noticed because he had not been looking for the change. The margins on corn and hay had been compressing for years, and his response to compressing margins had been to increase efficiency, which meant buying bigger equipment and taking on debt to service the equipment and running more acres to justify the debt. He had been accelerating in the direction he had always been going without ever asking whether the direction itself was the right one. Zebediah Calloway had looked at 40 acres of broken ground that Jarvis had dismissed in 40 minutes, and had spent 2 years understanding it before he planted a single thing. That was not what efficient men did, but the result was sitting in 11 containers in a barn across Meadow Creek, and it was worth more than anything Jarvis's 400 acres had produced this year. It was occurring to him now, sitting at his kitchen table in the November dark, and the arriving of it was not comfortable. But discomfort, he was old enough to know, was not the same as damage. Sometimes it was closer to instruction. Cordelia came up from Roanoke the last weekend of September. She had not told Zebediah she was coming. She pulled up the lane on a Friday evening, and he came out of the barn to meet her, hands dusty, expression giving nothing away. They ate supper without much conversation at first. She had brought groceries, things he would not buy for himself, and she cooked while he cleaned up from the day, and they sat at the kitchen table in the ease of two people who do not need to fill silence with noise to feel comfortable in each other's presence. Then she put her fork down and looked at him. She said, "I want to know about Margaret." He looked up. She said, "I found the notebook in April. Not the soil notebook. The other one. The market research that goes back to 2014. He was quiet for a moment. She said, "You started all of this before she got sick." He said, "Yes." She said, "Did she know?" He said Margaret was the only person he had ever told. He said she was the one who pushed him to stop waiting. He said she had told him more than once that he was going to spend his whole life preparing for something he kept finding reasons to delay, and that she was not going to let him do that anymore. He said she was in the hospital the last time when she made him promise. Cordelia looked at the table for a moment. Then she said, "So all of this is partly hers." He said, "All of this is entirely hers in the ways that matter most." She did not say anything after that for a little while. The kitchen was quiet except for the sound of the creek running through the low ground at the edge of the property. Zebediah refilled her coffee without being asked. She wrapped both hands around the mug and looked out the dark window toward the slope she could not see from where she sat. Then she said, "I want to be here for the harvest." He said she would need to be ready to work before 4 in the morning. She said she understood that. He said the window was short and there was no room for anyone who was going to treat it like a visit. She said, "I know how to work." He looked at her for a moment. He said, "Bring 2 people you trust." The next morning she woke before he did, which he had not expected, and she was standing on the porch with coffee in her hand when he came outside at 3:45. She looked at the north slope in the early dark. He stood beside her and followed her gaze without speaking. Then Imogene Kinsley appeared at the fence line, which neither of them had anticipated. She had a jacket on and a basket over one arm, and she simply climbed through the fence rails without ceremony and without asking permission, the way a woman who has spent 70 years on farmland moves through the physical world. She walked up the slope toward the upper section and looked back at Zebediah. He said, "Imogene, the flowers are not open yet." She said, "I know that. I am looking at what you have built up here. I wanted to see it before the rush starts." She walked the slope, slowly stopping here and there, touching nothing. Looking at the soil, at the way the rows ran with the contour of the hill, at the spacing that maximized both drainage and planting density. When she came back down, she stood in front of Zebediah and said Calhoun would have wanted to see this. He said he thought Calhoun had probably seen enough in his life to know what this was going to become before it happened. Imogene looked at him for a long moment and then looked back up the slope. Then she said, "I will be here on the first morning." He did not argue. He had learned that arguing with Imogene Kinsley about what she intended to do was not a productive use of anyone's time. It was during that same weekend that Cordelia, walking back from Imogene's fence line, after a conversation she had not described to Zebediah, went to the shelf in the kitchen and took down the second notebook again. She opened it to the first page, the page with the 2014 date, and she read it more carefully than she had in April. At the back of the notebook, tucked into the inside cover, was a single folded sheet she had not noticed before. She unfolded it. It was not in Zebediah's handwriting. The paper was in Margaret's handwriting, the particular slanted cursive that Cordelia had grown up watching fill grocery lists and birthday cards, and the occasional letter when Margaret had something important to say and wanted to say it in a form that would last beyond the moment. The page had a title at the top. It said, "Saffron Feasibility, Rocky Slope Drainage, Virginia Microclimate." Below that, in smaller letters, it said, "Margaret says, go." Cordelia stood in the kitchen holding that piece of paper and not moving for a long time. Her mother had not just known about the plan. Her mother had been part of it, had written it down in her own hand with her own endorsement, and put it in the back of the notebook where it would be found eventually. Maybe not right away, maybe not until the person who needed to find it was ready to understand what it meant. She folded it carefully and put it back and closed the notebook and set it on the shelf. She stood in the kitchen for a long time. Outside, she could hear her father moving on the slope, the occasional sound of his boots on the rocky soil, the slight creak of the equipment he was using to check the final rows before dark. She had grown up watching him work with the same focused quietness, had grown up assuming the way children assume things about their parents, that this was simply his temperament, that some people were built this way and others were not. It had taken her until this moment, standing in a kitchen in Grayson County, holding a folded piece of paper in her mother's handwriting, to understand that what she had always read as temperament was actually something more deliberate than that. It was the discipline of a man who had decided very early what kind of work he was going to do in the world and had organized everything else in his life around the space that work required. And her mother had seen it. Not just seen it, but participated in it, had been the other half of a plan that neither of them had ever explained to anyone else, had put her name on a folded piece of paper in the back of a notebook so that someone would eventually find it and understand that this had never been one person's project. It had always been two people's project. One of them had simply finished the work after the other could no longer be there. She went outside and stood in the yard looking up at the slope where her father was working. She did not call out to him. She looked at him for a while, this man who had been building this thing for 15 years, in the quiet space between everything else he was doing, and then she went to help. It came on a Tuesday night in the last week of September. Zebediah woke at 3:40 as he always did. He pulled on his clothes in the dark and made coffee by habit, and then he opened the back door and stepped outside. The smell was the first thing. There is a particular quality to the air on a Grayson County morning in late September, cool and mineral, and carrying the faint sweetness of creek water off the lower pastures. He had breathed that air every morning for 2 years. He knew its ordinary character exactly. This morning it was different. There was something underneath the ordinary smell, something floral and faint and entirely new. Like the beginning of a conversation in a language he had been studying for years and was finally hearing spoken natively for the first time. He looked up at the north slope. In the darkness, he could not see color clearly, but he could see that the hillside had changed its shape in the night. There was a texture to it now that had not been there the morning before, a softness across the upper section that resolved as his eyes adjusted into the outline of thousands of small blooms opening across the rocky ground. The slope was covered, not in patches, but across the whole of the upper section from the eastern tree line to the rocky western edge. The saffron crocuses had opened overnight in the cool September dark. He stood at the edge of the yard and looked at it for a long time without moving. He did not take out his phone. He did not call anyone. He went inside and poured his coffee and came back out and sat on the porch step and looked at the slope in the dark. He could hear the creek. He could hear a wood thrush starting up in the trees to the north. The sky was beginning to lighten at the far edge of the ridge. He sent Cordelia a message, 2 words, "Come up." Then he got his harvest baskets from the barn and set them by the gate and went inside to find his sharpening stone, because in 10 days or less, every flower on that hillside would need to be handled before sunrise, and there was not a moment to lose to anything except the work. Across Meadow Creek in the house with the newer tractor and the operating loan and the kitchen light that had been on since midnight, Jarvis Ferris had not slept well either. He had been awake since 2, lying in the dark, thinking about a row of numbers that did not add up the way they used to. Beatrix was asleep beside him. He got up and went to the kitchen and stood at the window that faced east toward the creek, toward the slope he could not see in the dark, but knew was there. He had spent years looking at that property from this window and seeing nothing worth his attention. He was beginning to understand, in the slow and uncomfortable way that genuine understanding arrives in a man who has been certain for a long time that what he had seen when he looked at that ground had always said more about the limits of his own framework than about the limits of the land. Cordelia arrived before the sky had any color in it. She pulled up the lane at 4 in the morning with 2 women from Roanoke in the back seat, both of them half asleep and not entirely sure what they had agreed to. She had told them to bring warm layers and boots they did not mind ruining, and to be prepared to work without much explanation. They had trusted her judgment. They were about to find out whether that trust was well placed. Zebediah was already on the slope when her headlights swept across the yard. He had been up there for 20 minutes, moving through the rows with a headlamp and a harvest basket, hands working in the particular steady rhythm of a man who has rehearsed a task so many times in his mind that the physical execution of it feels less like beginning something than like completing something long overdue. The flowers were open. In the beam of the headlamp, they were a deep, saturated purple against the dark soil, vivid in the way that only living color can be vivid, when it arrives in a place that has been waiting for it. Cordelia got out of the car and stood in the cold air and looked up at the slope. Her two friends came up beside her and nobody said anything for a moment. Then one of them, a woman named Beth, who worked in Cordelia's office and had driven 3 hours on the strength of a phone call the night before, said quietly, "What are we looking at?" Cordelia said saffron. Beth said, "Like the spice?" Cordelia said yes. Beth looked at the slope again in the early dark, at the thousands of small blooms, catching the edge of the headlamp light at Zebediah, moving through the rows with the focused calm of someone who has been waiting for this exact morning for 2 years. She said, "Okay, tell me what to do." Imogene Kinsley came through the fence at 4:30, exactly the same way she had come through it the morning she had walked the slope before the harvest, without ceremony, and without asking, in the manner of a woman who has been doing whatever needed doing on farmland since before most people in the county were born. She had a headlamp of her own and a wide flat basket she had made from split white oak in a style her mother had taught her. She took a position at the far end of the eastern row and began working without being told anything, her hands moving with a sureness that surprised the two women from Roanoke, who had assumed they would be the ones who needed the least instruction. Zebediah watched Imogene settle into her row and felt something he did not have an easy word for. Gratitude was part of it. But underneath gratitude was something about continuity, about the fact that the knowledge of how to do careful work with your hands in the early morning cold was not a thing that belonged to any one person or any one generation, and that Imogene Kinsley carrying her white oak basket up that slope in the dark was part of the same long chain that included his father's hands and Margaret's handwriting and a row of old bricks laid by someone whose name he would never know. He went back to his row without saying any of that, but he carried it with him. The work was quiet and specific. Each bloom had to be cupped in the palm, and the 3 crimson threads inside lifted out with 2 fingers, not pulled but lifted with enough care that the thread came away intact and enough speed to move to the next flower before the light changed. Zebediah showed Cordelia the motion once. She watched and did it herself on the next flower, and he watched her hands and nodded and moved on. She showed Beth and the other woman. They were slow at first, as everyone is slow at first, and then less slow, and then by the second hour they had found the rhythm that the work creates in the hands of anyone who pays attention to it. As the sky began to lighten and the headlamps became less necessary, and the color of the slope became fully visible for the first time, both of Cordelia's friends from Roanoke stopped working for a moment, without quite meaning to, and looked at what surrounded them. Thousands of small purple flowers open across the rocky hillside in the early October light, the air carrying that faint new floral note that Zebediah had smelled before anyone else that morning. The mist from the creek below beginning to thin as the temperature rose by its first few degrees. Beth said something quiet to the other woman, and the other woman nodded, and then they both went back to work without elaborating, because some things are more accurately expressed by continuing the task than by trying to find words for them. Imogene worked at a pace that appeared unhurried and covered ground steadily, the kind of efficiency that comes from having performed careful manual work across many decades. Her basket filled more quickly than the others, not because she was moving faster, but because she was not wasting a single motion. Zebediah watched her once from the end of his own row and thought about Calhoun, who had planted apple trees on ground nobody believed in, and thought about his father, who had worked land that nobody had taught him how to save, and thought about the row of old bricks in the lower field, and understood that he was standing inside a chain of ordinary human effort that extended in both directions much further than he could see. The slope was quiet except for the sound of boots on soil and the occasional exchange of low voices and the creek running fast over the rocks in the tree line. Norval Burwell arrived on the third morning. He pulled up the lane at 7 after sunrise, which meant the harvest crew had already been working for 3 hours and the best of the day's picking was done. He had a contract in his jacket pocket, not the same contract he had brought before. This one had different numbers. Zebediah came down from the slope when he saw the car. He was carrying a full basket, and his hands were stained the faint yellow-orange of saffron threads. He set the basket down by the gate and looked at Norval. Norval said he wanted to make one final offer before the harvest was complete. He said the number was higher than anything he had shown before. He said the food market for domestic traceable saffron was larger than Zebediah might understand from where he was standing, and that having the right buyer in place before the word fully got out was protection, not a concession. Zebediah looked at him for a moment. He said, "Norval, I appreciate that you have driven here 3 times. That tells me something about what you believe this is worth. And I want you to think carefully about the fact that every time you have driven here, the number has gone up. That pattern does not suggest that locking in a price right now is good for me." Norval was quiet. Zebediah said, "Come back after harvest is complete. If you still want to talk, we will talk. But I am not signing anything before I know exactly what I have." Norval looked at the baskets lined up by the barn at the crew still working the upper rows at the scale of what was clearly already a significant harvest. He was a man who moved through the specialty food world with a clear sense of his own sophistication, who understood markets and supply chains and the particular leverage that comes from being the person who connects a producer to a buyer before the producer fully understands what they have. That leverage in this instance was not available to him, and the realization of that was visible on his face for a moment before he controlled it. He nodded once, the nod of a man recalibrating what he thought he understood, and got back in his car and drove away. This time he did not make calls on Route 58. He drove and thought carefully about the conversation he had just had with a man who understood his own position better than Norval had given him credit for, and who had stated that understanding in 5 sentences without raising his voice or showing any particular emotion about it. In Norval's experience, people who were uncertain of their position talk more, and people who were certain of it talked less. Zebediah Calloway had used fewer words in 3 visits than most producers used in a single phone call, and each time the fewer words had contained more information than the more words would have. He would come back after harvest. He would come with a different kind of offer, one that treated Zebediah as what he actually was, which was a sophisticated producer who had built something with real market value, rather than as a grower who needed to be guided toward understanding what he had. The approach would need to change because the man had made it clear in the quietest possible way that it would have to. That afternoon, Gwendolyn Whitmore called. She said she had something to tell him and she was going to say it directly. She said the journalist she had brought to the property on the second day of harvest, a writer for a regional agricultural publication who had agreed to hold any story until Zebediah gave approval, had published something online the night before. Not a full story, a short item, no address, no full name, but enough identifying detail about the soil rehabilitation work and the crop type and the county that anyone paying attention in the right circles could piece together the location within a day or two. She said she was sorry. She said she had trusted the writer and that trust had not been warranted, and she took full responsibility. Zebediah was quiet for a long moment. She said his name. He said, "Gwendolyn, I am not angry with you, but I need you to think about something. That story is going to be told now, whether I want it to be or not. The question is whether it gets told right or whether it gets told by people who only know the surface of it. I need you to help me tell it right." She said she would do anything he needed. He said then, "Come out here, bring your notebook, not the extension notebook. The other one, the one you were going to use for the story you wanted to write for other farmers." She arrived the following morning while the crew was still in the upper rows. She sat at the edge of the slope with her notebook and watched and wrote, and occasionally Zebediah came and answered a question she had saved for a pause in the work. Agnes had known Zebediah for long enough to understand how he wanted things described, which was accurately and without embellishment, because the accurate version was more remarkable than any embellishment could reach. It was while Gwendolyn was sitting at the slope's edge on that 4th morning that she saw Jarvis Ferris appear at the eastern fence line. He came on foot across his own fields, boots wet from the creek crossing field dust on his jacket that had not come from a car. He stood at the fence and did not call out. He just looked at what was in front of him. The thousands of purple flowers, the crew working the rows before the sun fully cleared the ridge, the scale of what 2 years of quiet preparation had made possible, on ground he had once dismissed in 40 minutes. Gwendolyn recognized him. She did not write anything in her notebook about what she was seeing. Some things belonged to the people who were living them. Cordelia saw Jarvis first and started toward the fence. Zebediah was at the far end of the western row, and he looked up and read the situation quickly enough to stop her with a look and a slight shake of his head. She stopped. He handed his basket to Beth and walked down the slope toward the fence himself. Jarvis watched him come. He had his hands in his jacket pockets and his jaw set in the way it gets when a man is working through something difficult and has decided to speak before he has finished working through it, because he understands that waiting for the perfect moment to say the necessary thing means it may never be said. Zebediah came to the fence and stopped. The two men looked at each other. They were roughly the same age, both past 60, both carrying the particular kind of weathered quality that comes from decades of physical work in outdoor weather. They had grown up in adjacent counties. They had both learned to farm from fathers who had learned it from their own fathers. They had arrived at very different places by very different methods, and both of them understood that. Jarvis said I was wrong. He said it plainly without preamble, the way a man says something when he has rehearsed it enough times that what remains is only the true thing. He said not just about the land, about how I was looking at it, about what I thought farming was supposed to produce, and what kind of ground was worth the time to understand. I walked this property twice, and I did not see what you saw, and I have spent the last several weeks thinking about why that is. Zebediah did not say anything yet. Jarvis said, and I made some calls I should not have made. To Landon and to Xander, I was not trying to hurt you, but I was trying to find something that would let me be right when I already knew I was not. That is not something I am proud of. Zebediah looked at him for a moment. He said, Jarvis, I know you are not a man who says any of that easily. Jarvis said no, he was not. Zebediah looked back at the slope, at the crew working the rows at Imogene Kinsley, moving slowly and precisely along the far edge with her white oak basket. He looked at the color of the hillside in the morning light, still startling, even after 4 days, the color that the ground had been working toward for 2 years, without anyone but him knowing it was coming. He said, are you here to watch, or are you here to work? Jarvis looked at him. He said he had not brought a basket. Zebediah said, come through the gate. He went to the barn and came back with a spare basket. Zebediah walked him to the beginning of an unharvested row in the middle section and showed him the motion, once cupping the flour and lifting the threads with 2 fingers. Jarvis watched and then bent down and did it himself. His hands were large and accustomed to rougher work, and the motion was awkward at first, as it is for everyone at first. But he was careful with it. He worked in that row for 2 hours without saying much. Zebediah worked nearby. They did not have the kind of conversation that resolves everything in a single morning. But they worked alongside each other in the cool October air, and that was a beginning of something. When Jarvis left that afternoon, walking back toward the creek crossing, he paused once and looked back at the slope. Then he kept walking. Beatrix was in the kitchen when he came home. She looked at his hands, at the faint yellow-orange color that had transferred to his fingers from the threads, and she said, where have you been? He sat down at the table. He said he had been at Zebediah Calloway's place. She was quiet for a moment. Then she set a cup of coffee in front of him and sat down across the table and said, tell me about it. He did. He told her about the slope and the scale of it, about the crew working the rows before sunrise, about Imogene Kinsley with her white oak basket, about the 2 years of preparation he now understood had gone into that hillside. He told her about the conversation at the fence, what he had said, and what Zebediah had said after it. Beatrix listened without interrupting. She had known Zebediah since high school, and she had known Jarvis for 40 years, and she understood both men well enough to hear what was underneath what he was saying, which was not really about saffron at all. When he was done, she said, what are you going to do now? He said he was going to think very carefully about what he had been doing with his own ground, and whether the framework he had been using was actually serving him. She said that sounds like a good place to start. The 8th morning of harvest was the last. Zebediah walked the upper slope one final time in the early dark, moving through the rows with a headlamp checking for any blooms that had been missed. There were not many. The crew had been thorough. The slope was quiet now, in the specific silence of work that has been completed rather than work that is about to begin. Cordelia walked the slope with him. She had been there every morning working the rows with the steadiness she applied to everything she decided to take seriously. By the 4th day, she was faster than either of the women she had brought from Roanoke, and by the 6th day, she was keeping pace with Imogene. She did not mention this. She did not need to. They came back down to the yard as the sky turned the pale gray that comes before the actual color of sunrise arrives. The harvest containers were sealed and arranged in the truck bed, 11 of them, each labeled with the date and zone of harvest. 11 pounds of dried saffron threads from a hillside that Jarvis Ferris had walked away from, and every extension agent in the county had described as structurally depleted and not worth the input costs. At current specialty market prices for domestic, traceable, high-quality American-grown saffron, what was sitting in those 11 containers exceeded the full purchase price of the property in a single harvest from a hillside that everyone had agreed was worthless. The number itself was almost secondary to what it represented. Zebediah had not built this operation because he needed to prove a financial point to anyone. He had built it because Margaret had told him to stop waiting, because he had spent 20 years reading other people's land and had understood for most of those 20 years exactly what kind of land he was looking for and what he would do with it when he found it. The money was real and it mattered, because money is what allows a thing to continue and to grow and to be shared with other people. But the deeper satisfaction was not about the money. It was about the 2 years of mornings before the neighboring porch lights came on, and the February night on frozen ground, and the notebook full of numbers going back to 2014 in the row of old bricks laid by someone whose name he would never know, and all the 31 people who had stood in the rain and known something without saying it. It was about the fact that the ground had always been capable of this. It had been capable of it the entire time Jarvis Ferris had owned the adjacent 400 acres and looked across the property line and seen nothing worth his attention. The ground had simply been waiting for someone who was willing to take the time to understand what it needed. Zebediah sat on the tailgate of his truck and looked at the containers and did not say anything for a while. Cordelia sat beside him. The light was coming up over the ridge, the particular early light of Grayson County in October that turns the fields and the creek bottoms and the far slopes of the Blue Ridge into something that does not have a useful name, but that people who have grown up around it carry in their memory as the specific color of home. She said, "What does it feel like?" He thought about that for a genuine moment before answering. He said, "It feels like something I promised someone that I kept." She was quiet for a beat. Then she said, "I found the note. In the back of the notebook. In Margaret's handwriting." He did not look at her. He looked at the ridge. He said she put it there. Cordelia said, "I know." He said she wanted someone to find it. She always said that promises meant more when someone else could witness them even after the fact. That was exactly who she was. Cordelia said yes, that was exactly who she was. They sat there together on the tailgate while the light came all the way up, and the fog in the creek bottom began to lift, and the ordinary morning sounds of the valley resumed around them. A truck went by on Route 58. A dog barked somewhere down the road. The wood thrush started up in the tree line the way it did every morning, and then stopped in the silence after it was clean and complete. After a while, Cordelia said, "I called my office yesterday." He looked at her. She said she had arranged a leave of absence, 12 months with the possibility of extending. She was not asking his permission. She was telling him what she had decided. She said the operation needed someone who could manage the business side, the contracts, the relationships with buyers, the planning for expansion, and that she had been doing that kind of work for 8 years, and she was good at it, and she wanted to do it for something that mattered to her in a way that her current work had never quite managed to. He said, "You understand what you are giving up." She said she understood exactly what she was giving up, and she had thought about it carefully, and she was not making a sentimental decision. She was making a practical one informed by sentiment, which he said was different. He looked at her for a long moment. He said, "Then you start learning soil testing next week." She said she had already ordered the materials. He got off the tailgate and picked up one of the harvest containers and carried it toward the barn. She picked up another one and followed him. That was how it began, not with a ceremony or a declaration, but with the ordinary physical fact of two people carrying the same thing in the same direction. Xander Hargrove called it that afternoon. Zebediah almost did not pick up. He was checking the curing setup in the barn, and his phone was in his pocket. But something made him answer. Xander said he had been hearing things and had been thinking about them. He said the county had an agricultural development initiative looking for strong case studies, and that what Zebediah had done out on Route 58 was exactly the kind of story they needed. He said he wanted to feature the operation in a formal report and potentially a presentation to other landowners in the area who were sitting on ground they had written off. Zebediah said, "Xander, I appreciate that." Then he said, "I have one condition." Xander asked what it was. Zebediah said he wanted the presentation to include a full account of the process, not just the outcome. He said it needed to show the 2 years of soil work, in the research, in the patience, because if people only saw the result, they would draw the wrong lesson. He said the lesson was not that saffron was a magic answer for anyone with rocky ground. The lesson was what happened when someone took the time to understand the ground they were working with before deciding what it could or could not do. Xander said that was reasonable. Zebediah said there was one more thing. He said he thought it would be useful to invite some of the local farmers who had been skeptical of the approach to attend, because that kind of conversation produced better outcomes than a room full of people who had already decided to agree. Xander was quiet for a moment. He said, "Anyone specific you have in mind?" Zebediah said he thought Jarvis Ferris might have something to contribute. There was a pause on the line. Xander Hargrove, who knew exactly who had called him about the permit 4 months earlier, said, "I will reach out to him, too." Zebediah thanked him and hung up. He stood in the barn for a moment with the phone in his hand. Outside, he could hear Cordelia on the phone with someone working out the details of a supply arrangement with the restaurant group from Asheville that had been calling since the third day of harvest. She had a notebook open on the hood of her car, and she was writing in it with the same focused efficiency that Margaret had brought to anything she organized. And seeing it from a distance was one of those moments that arrive without warning and ask more of you than you expected to give. He put his phone away and went back to work. Imogene came over that evening while there was still light. She did not knock, but came around the side of the house to the barn the way neighbors on farmland come when they do not want to make their visit feel more formal than it is. She looked at the curing setup, at the containers arranged in their careful rows, at the meticulous organization of everything. She said, "Calhoun would have liked you." He said, "I think I would have liked him." She said, "You would have." He did not talk very much either, but when he had something to say, it was usually worth the wait. She stood there for a moment, and then she said, "I want to tell you something." She said she had not told many people about the 3 years she spent alone after Calhoun died, harvesting the apples and hauling them to Galax and managing everything by herself. She said it had been hard in the particular way that work done out of loyalty to someone who is no longer there to see it is hard, which is a kind of hard that does not get easier with time, but does grow quieter. She said she had kept doing it because Calhoun had been right, and she wanted the record to show that he had been right, even if the only person keeping that record was her. She said, "What you did up there on that slope is the same thing. You were keeping a record." He said, "Margaret kept the record. I just executed it." Imogene was quiet for a moment. She looked at the curing containers and then at the open door of the barn and the dark shape of the empty slope beyond it. She said, "Calhoun used to say that the hardest thing about planning something that takes years to produce is that you are always doing work today that you will not fully understand until later. You never know while you are doing it whether the faith you are putting into the ground is going to be returned. You just keep going because the alternative is to stop, and stopping means admitting that the future is not worth preparing for." He was not a philosophical man in the ordinary sense. He was a man who worked with his hands and thought with his hands and talked mostly about practical things. But he understood something about the relationship between work and time that a lot of people never get to. She said, "I think you understood the same thing." I think Margaret understood it too, and I think that is why she wrote her name on that piece of paper and put it where it would be found. Imogene said that is what partnership looks like between people who understood each other well enough to trust the other's judgment, even across time. She left shortly after walking back through the fence. Zebediah watched her go and then turned back to the barn and finished what he was doing in the quiet that settled over the property as the last light left the ridge. The second plot was already planned. He had mapped it in August before the harvest began because preparation does not wait for results when you already know the results are coming. The eastern section of the property closer to the tree line where the soil had a different character than the north slope. Less rocky, more clay in the profile, more prone to moisture retention at certain depths during the wet months of March and April, when the snow melt came off the ridge and pooled in the low areas. That moisture retention problem was not unfixable. It was a drainage problem, and drainage problems were addressable if you were willing to do the work. He had already sketched out a tiling approach that would move excess water off the planting zone without stripping the moisture the corms would need during the dry weeks of August. He had priced the materials. He had identified the equipment he would need to rent. It would need different mineral amendments than the North Slope because the base chemistry was different. The clay fraction held certain minerals in ways that affected plant availability, and his spring soil test had already told him what the eastern section was missing and in what proportions. He had already ordered the follow-up test to confirm the numbers before he started any amendment work. 2 more years of building before he would put anything in the ground over there. That was the timetable. He had no interest in rushing it. Cordelia, when she found out, said 2 more years. He said yes. She said, "We are not doing one section at a time anymore. We should be planning both sections simultaneously so the builds are offset. That way we are harvesting every year instead of every other year." He looked at her. She had the notebook open and was already sketching a timeline, the kind of organized project plan she had been producing for construction schedules for 8 years, adapted now to soil preparation cycles and planning windows and market timing. He said, "You have been thinking about this." She said she had been thinking about it since April, when she found the market research notebook and understood that the operation had never been designed to stay small. He looked at the timeline. He had to admit, a better approach than the one he had been planning alone. He said the eastern section will need more calcium work than the North Slope. The base mineral profile is different, and the moisture retention issue compounds that. She wrote that down without looking up. She said, "Noted." What else? He pulled up a stool and sat beside her at the workbench, and they went through it together, the two of them in the barn with the harvest curing behind them and the empty North Slope visible through the open door. The ground already at rest again in the October dark, already doing the slow invisible work that land does when it is finally given what it needs and left in peace to respond. The last morning came the way all important mornings eventually come, without announcement, wearing the ordinary clothes of another day. Zebediah was up before 4. He walked the North Slope one more time, not because there was anything left to harvest, but because he needed to stand on it in the early dark and feel the particular quality of a thing that has been completed in the way only patient work can be completed. The ground was bare now. The crocuses spent the foliage pulled low against the soil in the way saffron plants look after harvest. Not dead but resting, gathering back into themselves what they had given. In spring, the foliage would green and strengthen and die back again, and through the following autumn, the corms would multiply in the dark, beneath the surface, quietly building toward the next flowering, the way all growing things build toward what they are meant to do when the conditions are finally right. Cordelia came up the slope and stood beside him. She had a coffee thermos, and she handed it to him, and he drank. They looked out across the valley, across Meadow Creek, where Jarvis Ferris's barn lights were coming on in the distance, across the far ridge where the first thin line of morning was beginning to define itself against the sky. She said, "What do you want the operation to be in 10 years? He thought about it for a genuine moment rather than answering quickly. He said, "I want it to demonstrate something, not just that this ground can produce saffron. That is already demonstrated. I want it to be the kind of place where people can come and understand that most land that has been called worthless was called that because someone looked at it without knowing what it needed. I want to show that the knowledge is the thing, not the acreage, not the equipment, not the capital. The knowledge and the willingness to let the land tell you what it can do, instead of telling it what you expect from it." Cordelia listened to all of that. Then she said, "I can work with that." He handed the thermos back to her. He pulled the soil probe from his coat pocket, the one he had owned for 19 years, and sharpened himself and pushed it into the soil at the upper edge of the harvested zone. He pulled the core and held it in his hand and looked at it in the pre-dawn gray. The soil was dark and structured alive with the fine white threads of fungal networks that ran through healthy ground, the way nerves run through living tissue, connecting root to root, cycling nutrients, doing the slow, continuous work that most people never see because it happens entirely out of sight. He held the core out to Cordelia. She took it and looked at it carefully, the way he had been teaching her to look not at the surface, but at the structure beneath the surface. She said it is darker than it was in the spring, and there are threads in it, white threads running through the whole thing. He said those threads are mycelium, fungal networks. They were not here 2 years ago. They are here now because the biology has been restored, because the conditions were finally right for them to establish, because someone was willing to take the time to understand what this ground needed before deciding what it was capable of producing. She handed the core back to him. He placed it gently back in the hole and pressed the soil closed over it with his thumb, the way you close something that has been said completely and does not need to be said again. He stood up and looked at the ridge where the light was fully coming. Now the particular October light of a Grayson County morning that arrives without asking anything from you, except to stand still for a moment and let it come. Across Meadow Creek, Jarvis Ferris's barn lights had been on for an hour. There was no way to know from here what he was doing in that barn at this hour, but he was there, which was something. A man who wakes early and goes to work before the day is fully formed is at least asking himself what he is building toward, even if he does not yet have the complete answer. The second plot waited on the eastern edge of the property under soil that had been resting all summer since Zebediah walked it with a probe in August and read what it was and what it needed. 2 years from now, if the preparation was done right, if the minerals were balanced, and the biology was restored and the drainage was managed through the wet springs that the eastern section was prone to, there would be another flowering on ground that currently looked like nothing worth the attention. He knew that. He could see it already, the way he had always seen these things, not as a certainty, but as a probability so well supported by the evidence that the difference between the two was mostly a question of patience. He said your mother was right. Cordelia said she usually was. He said land does not lie. You just have to know how to listen. And then they went to work.